Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Con el objetivo de entender mejor los aspectos relacionados al medio ambiente, hoy vamos a estar hablando de agua y de comunicación. Y para esto estamos hoy acá con Gabrielle Lee Look. Gabrielle es comunicadora social y tiene una maestría en desarrollo de negocios e innovación. Adicionalmente cuenta con más de 15 años de experiencia en comunicaciones en temas específicos de agua, concretamente en el Caribe, y actualmente es consultora independiente en temas de comunicaciones y relacionamiento estratégico. Gabriel, welcome to Poder Ambiental. How are you?
Thank you very much, Juan. It's really an honor to be one of your guests. I'm
Thank
fine.
you. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. According to your experience, what is the role of communication in water management?
Okay, so Juan, before I even answer that question, what is important? You asked me what is the role of communication in water management. But what I want to make very clear is that communication is the core, or at least I believe, is the core of effective water management. I see it as the anchor. So whether it's prioritized or not is another matter. However, but essentially, I see the role as one, communication being a way to convey messages and to storytell to different audiences, because water management in itself is very complex. So I see it as a way of reaching various audiences and various stakeholders in a way to either inspire them, empower them, create awareness or build understanding, or signal a call to action. You want to get something out of them. I also see it as a way, communication, very, very important, is a way of conveying technical information, because I know we're going to get to that. Technical information in a more understandable and palatable way, because we're trying to reach various audiences when we talk about water resources management. So I also see the role of communication as being very important in being that bridge in breaking down those sort of complex and technical information in a way that is understood by all, based on my experience. And another role I see it as being very important is connecting stakeholders. When we talk about water management, we're talking about the complexity of different stakeholders. We always say water is everyone's business. It really is true, as cliched as it may be. So I see communication as a way to connect various stakeholders that all play a pivotal role in water resources management.
Yes, because there's plenty of people involved in water management, and connecting stakeholders, it's a must within that process, although it's not simple, because stakeholders have different interests, specifically around water, that it's a vital resource. That's very challenging, isn't it?
Definitely.
Definitely. Okay, so what are the main challenges in communicating the importance of water? And if you could say that specifically to the Caribbean.
Okay, so based on my experience, as you know, I've been in water for the past 14 years as a communication specialist, right? And just as this is from my opinion, my observation, one of the main, I would say, challenges would be that there are so many other issues that take precedence over water. There are other topics that we would say they're more hot topics. They are of more interest. They capture more attention of various audiences, possibly when compared to water. So communicating on water is very complex, and it could sometimes be overshadowed by a lot of other hard-hitting topics, and we will also get to that. So I see that as being one of the main issues when communicating about water. I would say that sometimes you have to really link that water to sort of a broader environmental issue, whether it be climate change. When we speak about droughts and hurricanes, that may be more attention-grabbing. So I see that as one of the main issues. Also, as we said before, communicating on water is very complex. There are different target audiences there. It's everyone's business. So how do you really communicate to everyone? That in itself is very difficult. So you have to find, one of the challenges I have found over the years is always being strategic, finding ways to be strategic in crafting messages and stories to different audiences, particularly those that are non-technical, outside of this water box. So I've seen one of the challenges is in trying to capture the attention of those audiences or those stakeholders that are not necessarily operating within the water sector or know much about water resources management. So it's really being able to tailor your communications messages to a diverse audience, which is really a skill, right? And another major issue I see, or I have seen based on my experience, is the lack of trying things, different things, being more innovative and creative, not just doing business as usual when it comes to water. You're trying to get your messages across to various audiences, a lot of audiences. So it's the ability to try to strive to do things a little more innovatively, sort of redefine the way in which we communicate on water. And Poder Ambiental, for example, is an excellent example of that. You're telling stories, you're telling conversations using Instagram and other tools in a different way that will capture different audiences. So from my experience, that has been some of the top challenges in communicating about water management.
Gabrielle, do you think that, I mean, you were saying that water communication is overshadowed by other topics, but for example, water becomes a pressing issue when it's scarce.
Exactly.
So only when it's a problem, and when it's a problem, it's too late for that. How to induce those messages of importance, not facing scarcity of water, because that's a challenge, something that is so vital and is regarded as not important because it's there. That's the tragedy, or the tragedy of that, isn't it?
Yeah, I completely see your point, and that's why I said sometimes communicating about water, when it comes to water scarcity and it's affecting you, then it becomes a major problem. So I would say in terms of like overcoming that challenge, we have to find ways apart from the water scarcity. We've been talking about the global water crisis for years, but then climate change just comes in and overshadows even that. So in terms of really trying to get the messages out there, I would say you have to try to link water, when you're communicating to water, to broader issues, whether it be climate change, whether it be health, environmental sustainability, economic growth, because you have to try to reach this myriad of target audiences, or everyone, but you have to do it in a way that they understand this is how it affects me. What is my role in this, and how is this affecting me? Sometimes you see, as I mentioned, that a lot of other topics tend to overshadow water because sometimes you may not be affected. It may not touch you as something that's urgent to you. So there needs to be sometimes a greater linkage of water into other developmental topics or other things. We talked about we talked about water scarcity, but when we speak about hurricanes and droughts, I mean, that's more attention grabbing than anything. And then when we speak about a hurricane and a drought, what happens in a hurricane and droughts? There is a pressure on water resources. There may not be potable water for persons to drink. So all of a sudden it becomes this major issue to persons who may not have necessarily felt it was that important before. So it is a challenge, and it is a fact that other topics or other issues sometimes will take precedence or get more attention than water. And as I said, that has been one of the challenges I've seen, but it is a process. There's no hard and fast way of communicating on water. It is a process.
It is a process. You were mentioning climate change, and on that topic, I wanted to ask you, why do you think why climate change is much more popular than water internationally?
Well, first of all, there are a number of reasons. Again, from my observations, I would say I would give it to the climate change advocates. Maybe their communication strategies have been way more influential than the water strategies, but the reality is that there has been a dedicated effort to raise awareness on a larger scale. I would say compared to water in recent times, in recent years, there has been this sort of coming together of conveying the urgency of this global climate crisis when compared to, although the global water crisis still exists and has existed for years, I see that there has been a lot more effective, probably, communication strategies in conveying the urgency of the issue of climate change. The advocates of climate change have done a significant job in being able to communicate it as a global crisis. I would say it's debatable, but it also possibly receives more media coverage than water, right? There's also an argument that I have seen in my observation, there's been a lot of access to climate funding. And in being able to have a lot more access to climate funding, there's probably more studies, more data, when compared to possibly some of the water challenges we're experiencing there. So when we talk about why there's more probably attention, there's probably a lot more availability of resources to deal with climate-related things. And I would also say from my observation, there are a lot of policy frameworks that are being put in place probably faster than for climate change and water. When we talk about all of the big international agreements as it relates to climate policy, regulations being pushed, I would say that water-related policies, when we talk about even the Caribbean, have been more fragmented. So I would say these are some of the reasons why I have observed that climate change has seemed to come to the forefront more than water, even though the water crisis has existed from a very long time.
Longer than that, but you were mentioning influence and advocates. So I think all the celebrities that are talking about climate change, how influential is that? Do you think that if more famous people would talk about the water crisis, would we have a brother? I mean, it's really sad to think about that, but it's very efficient, isn't
you
it?
raised a very, very good point. I'm glad you said it, because I said that there have been a lot more dedicated efforts on a larger scale, possibly compared to water. When we think about climate advocacy, I'm sure the name Greta Thunberg comes to mind. We have all of these climate advocates, climate champions. We have all these youth advocates. I would say in terms of water, especially within the Caribbean region, we have a lot of young professionals, youth, that are very, very much taking a stand in terms of finding solutions for better water resources management. But again, coming back to what you said, there are the climate advocates and the climate champions have really taken on board this call for urgency. So I think there's a lot more visibility around the issue in a shorter space of time when compared to the number of years that persons have been promoting the need for better water resources management. So something as simple as you mentioned, celebrities, climate advocates, it's a real thing. And when we think of climate advocacy, as I said, Greta Thunberg and a lot of other persons come to mind. So it's a real thing. So it does come back down to communication strategies as well. It's all intertwined.
And the other thing that you were mentioning, that there's more data nowadays, but for example, the climate debate has information, but there's not much debate on that. What is shown, it's understood as truth, and there's no debate on that. It's truth, and it's that. Do you think that, the data that we're producing in terms of water, what could we do better in terms of communicating the importance of that, so that the water crisis, it's a given, so we don't have to explain it that often?
Yeah. So I want to give you a perspective from the Caribbean region, right? So I've worked in water as a communication specialist for a while in water, and what I've observed across the regions in different Caribbean countries, there's a lack of sharing of data as it relates to not just water, but a lot of things. So herein lies the problem already. There's a lack of data sharing, when compared to possibly even water. With the lack of data sharing, sometimes that turns into the duplication of effort. If we are aware of certain data that exists, that data can then be analyzed and used. And again, coming back to what we mentioned in breaking down that data for different audiences. For example, you are an applied economist, environmental economist, right? The data that you would use and internalize, let's say related to water resources management or urgent water related problem in a particular country, is going to be very different compared to if you're going to try to share that data with, let's say, the average person or someone who is not a non-technical person. So there's data that may exist, but how the data is being used is an issue. And that is also where communication comes into play, because you have to be able to break that data down so it is understood by different people.
Yes.
Right? different target audiences. A scientist is not going to you have to communicate that information to the scientist in a different way. But I know we're going to get to that later on. But as I said, the average person who doesn't know anything about why is water resources management so important, you're not going to capture their attention using the same strategy you may have used to communicate it to, let's say, a technocrat or a scientist,
So you need to be empathic in order to communicate better, to know.
You have to be able to not manipulate that data, but use that data to tell stories in different ways to different audiences. So the messages are clear and understood by the various persons that need to get the information.
To tell stories. That's the key word, isn't it? Stories. People relate to stories.
And compelling ones too.
Okay. Another question is, what's the relation between communication, power, and politics? That's
an interesting question. I would say that the communication, politics, and power are definitely interconnected. For example, with power and politics, you can influence the narrative with communication. So when we talk about power and politics, communication must come into play, because you can use communication to essentially tell compelling messages, just like what we said, to persuade audiences, right? And to use that power, use that communication for power or political power, right? I would say that communication in politics is also very strategic. How you frame issues is an art, right? How you frame issues, how you communicate specific issue is an art. It is not just like it could be, as I said, this is where the interplay comes into play. How you communicate the issue could be very strategic. So there is an interplay between communication, power, and politics. And to answer your question, I think like with power and politics, you can use communication to influence narratives. And I guess that's my simple response to that.
Yeah, because stories get in the mind of people, and then people understand things through those stories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people process their thoughts through the things that they receive that is communicated to them, isn't it? I mean, it's the agenda setting, and I find that absolutely amazing and interesting. Another question is, some of my followers are engineers or biologists. So there's a major problem.
Yeah.
I'm an engineer, and plenty of people think that when they're speaking, they are being understood, and they are not.
Yeah.
So what advice would you have for them in terms of communication? How important is communication in professional development?
Okay, so this question, I love this question, because I feel like in my 14 years as someone who is not, my background is communication, so I'm not a water person, right? So I love this question, because within my job and within my role, I've always interacted with engineers, biologists, academics, right? And my advice to them in terms of communication is to learn how to KISS. And when I say KISS, it's an acronym. Keep it simple, silly. It's an acronym I learned when I was in my undergrad in communication, and it was one of the first things I learned about communication. As you mentioned, within that field of engineers, biologists, technical persons, it is very common sometimes that they use a lot of technical jargon when they talk amongst themselves. So apart from using the overloading with technical jargon, what advice I have for them is that they also need to know their audience. So if they're talking amongst themselves, it's very easy for them to use the technical jargon. But from my experience, I've seen when they're not talking amongst themselves and they're talking to everyone, the technical jargon still comes out. And they're not understanding that they have to know their audience in being able to convey that information. So they still go out and they talk to, let's say, a group of students or young professionals who have no background in engineering or biology, and they still use this technical jargon and they don't qualify what they're saying. So apart from my advice is to avoid the jargon overload, keep it simple. They need to know their audience. And I also want to say, and I'm bringing it back to this platform as well, why not create engaging content, right? There are a lot of technical persons on TikTok, doctors, biologists, engineers, dentists, you name it, and they're creating compelling, easy to understand information on TikTok that would have never reached me or you to understand what they are conveying. So this comes back to what I was saying in terms of just trying to be a little more innovative and step out of the usual bureaucracy of what we know water management to be, and be willing to not just be authentic, but be willing to create engaging content. Even if you're a biologist and an engineer, you don't have to write a academic. You could write an academic article or that kind of thing. But there's so many more platforms now, as you know. And again, I'm coming back to your platform, right? You're using Instagram. You're using this type of format to get messages out that would normally never reach someone that is not a biologist or an engineer. Another piece of advice I would say is to be as authentic as possible. People know when you're not being authentic. And just be willing to continuously adapt. I think from my experience, there are a lot of persons within the technical realm, biologists, environmentalists, and persons who they may be not afraid, but they may not have the knowledge to know how they can just adapt the way that they share their messages. So also, my advice would be willing to continuously improve in terms of adapting your communication style. So avoiding the jargon, knowing your audiences, being willing to create engaging content and use platforms or use tools that you've never used before as an engineer. Because the reality is that, as I said, water is everyone's business. So an engineer just speaking to another engineer or decision maker or another technical person, it's not going to reach the quote unquote general public. It's not going to reach them and they're not going to understand. So
Thank you. That's spot on. Thank you very much. Gabrielle, the last two questions that I ask all my guests is what is power to you and what is politics?
okay, I love these controversial questions. So I would think that I always thought, for me, power was a lot of things to me. But now, in the world that we're living in, I think power is the ability to inspire and influence. That is what power is to me. And in terms of politics, which I normally don't speak about, again, I would say that politics is an interplay between power, ideas, and communication. I see politics as being this sort of interplay between power, ideas, and communication. And it is something that can be used to guide a society, shape decisions. It also could be seen as a means to an end, but that's all I would say about politics.
Perfect. Gabrielle, thank you very much for this time. Thank you for being here with us in Poder Ambiental. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for having me. It really is a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por estar acá y nos vemos entonces más adelante en otra conversación de Poder Ambiental. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you.
Bye bye.